thank you, everybody, for coming. The live streaming is a work in process, but that will come along in a minute, I'm sure. I believe I know just about all of you. I'm Tony Lathrop. I used to be on the Planning Commission, chaired it for 3 years. Now I'm the North Carolina Board of Transportation rep for this area and chair the Finance Committee of the Board of Transportation. And if, gosh, chaired this OAC committee for, I don't know, Laura, how many years? 4 something, 5. So anyway, I want to thank you all.
A slow start for us on our end.
Thank you all for your ongoing participation. Many of you have been in this since the beginning for those 4 or 5 years or however long it's been. And appreciate all of your time as this process continues to move along. I would thank Laura and Alan and your team for all the work you all continue to do. And I will continue to say that the fact that you are driving such a robust process of engagement over the years on this, continuing through now, is what is going to make it successful and what has made it successful so far. And I think it's really good for our city. It's going to drive a good outcome in this, because when you have a strong process, you get good outcomes. And by a strong process, I mean it's inclusive, transparent, and very rigorous. And as you see, community interest continues to rise in what we're doing, and even more so in the 2040 plan right now. So our work is even more important now. And so I just want to appreciate everybody. And I know we're going to come out the end with a good result. So thank you all. And I know we've got some of our special tree committee guests here again today. So Allison, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you just say a few things to kick it off.
Thanks, Tony. And as always, thank you for your dedication to this group and continued leadership. We appreciate having you as chair of this very important committee. Yes, there are a lot going on in the city right now with the comprehensive plan, and this is such an incredible part of that, because this is one of the key implementation tools of the comprehensive plan. So your work and your dedication and your feedback in this is very important to implementing those goals and priorities outlined in the comprehensive plan. We do have some special guests here today. We've got our tree canopy action plan stakeholders here to listen in and, as needed, provide perspective as to the discussions, the many meetings that we had as that group. And so first part, 2 weeks ago, we introduced you to a lot of data, some analysis that we had done as it relates to Charlotte's tree canopy, where it's trending, just some potential policy ideas that were discussed as part of the TCAP stakeholder group. And today we're going to get a little bit farther into some of the regulatory ideas of what will become part of the tree article. So I'm sure we'll have a robust discussion here today on trees, and I look forward to the discussion. And so with that, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for your participation and involvement, and I will turn it over to Alan.
Thank you, Allison. Just the usual housekeeping slides to start with. We hope to be live streaming today's meeting. I don't know if we've got that up and running yet, but if we don't, we'll keep working on it. And if we somehow aren't able to do that today, we are recording this meeting, and it will be available on the Charlotte UDO web page fairly soon. Andrew, do you have any good news for us on the live streaming end?
No, we're still getting an error message. Yeah.
All right, we're having some technical problem on that. So we may not be able to do it, but we are recording it, and you will be able to go back and watch it, or send other people to watch it as well. So as we've been doing throughout our most recent meetings, we're going to let staff narrate today's slides, and you can enter your comments or questions in the chat feature of Zoom, and we will try to keep up with them in real time. And we may periodically stop and open it up for your comments, your live comments or questions. And we certainly will do that at the end of the slides as well. With that, I am just going to turn it over to Tim Porter, I believe. Tim is going to take the next few slides.
Thank you, Alan, and good morning, everyone. I appreciate your time and interest. And I also look forward to the discussion today, and I'm sure in the months to come as we roll out more specific details about the tree article, the ordinance concepts, and actual language in the new tree article. This is the general format of today's presentation. Focus on the current ordinance, set some more framework for the presentation and how to kind of think about some of the big ticket items we're going to introduce today. We're not going to go through the article line by line, but we'll focus on some big ticket items, changes, and updates from a theme-based perspective. And Andrew will also be co-leading this, so it'll be Andrew and myself kind of tossing it back and forth between us as we move forward. So let's get started. So just a little bit more history. The proposed tree article ordinance concepts are really based on the policy work, recent policy work, including ongoing policy work from the Tree Canopy Action Plan, the comprehensive plan effort. A little bit more in the past was the Urban Forest Master Plan, a very high level tree canopy goal and kind of playbook for how Charlotte will see its and manage its tree canopy growth. And I'd also throw in 2019, there was that small effort, an urban sites text amendment to the ordinance that was part of the UDO initiative. So there was already a pretty big focus on tree regulations. And this is kind of, the second part in presentation, but also in the actual tree article regulations we're looking at today. So we can move on to the next slide. Sorry, I should have been quicker on that next slide, but again, there's the urban sites text amendment that took place 2 years ago in 2019, focused on providing more flexibility for urban sites, looked at tree save, it looked at perimeter trees, provided some more option for development customers. And we'll be building off of some of that as well with the new tree article in the UDO. All right, next slide. And you know what, I may ask Andrew. Andrew, do you feel comfortable kind of covering this one? I'm starting to veer out of my lane a little bit with the higher level kind of vision and connection.
Yeah, so this is a slide that we kind of present every week just to get people's minds kind of wrapped around the framing of the approach we're taking out of the comprehensive plan and the policies that are in there. We're really working to implement that vision through adjustments to our regulations and ordinances. And so you see a list here of all the sort of chapters and articles, or the chapters that we have today in the Code of Ordinances that will become articles in the UDO. And today we'll be focusing on trees, which is currently chapter 21, but in the coming UDO we'll have a new number. So just a kind of a reminder that anything that we're proposing here is coming out of a policy that is in the draft comprehensive plan.
Thank you, sir. Continuing to set a little bit of a framework and just an outline for how to think about the current tree ordinance. And apologies, hopefully you can't hear the ongoing work that's going on in the building I'm in right now. Hopefully these noise canceling headphones are working. There's some power tools going on nearby. There's really three key areas in the current tree ordinance. There's perimeter trees, kind of looking at the graphics on the right side of the slide. Three big buckets of development regulations. Perimeter trees, which are essentially street trees. That can be a blend of city trees out in public right-of-way, or it could be, trees along streets that are behind that right-of-way line on private property. Internal trees, which in many cases, if not most, is focused on surface parking lots, but there's also a component for internal trees that's directly related to impervious cover. And then tree save, which is a preservation area. The first two requirements are more focused on individual tree Realities, tree save is kind of a dual focus on actual protected land and acreage that has tree canopy in it. And the current outline of the ordinance is there on the left. And I think we'll spend most of our time talking about internal trees and tree save today as far as big ticket items for proposed changes. So jumping right in for perimeter trees, that can be a blend of city trees. City trees are protected city assets that are in public road right-of-way. That can be a blend of city or NCDOT public right-of-way. Also, city trees can be on city property, but really focusing on the street tree component today. In many, many cases, street trees are required to be planted as development permitting. We're looking to clarify and really provide good guidance on responsibility for any street trees, perimeter trees that are required to be planted by development ordinance, in this case, the tree article, and really simplify the language and terminology in that area of what will be the new tree article. And Andrew, please add anything that we need to have here.
No, that was good. Yeah.
Okay. Again, we'll be focusing mostly on internal trees and tree save. So internal trees, again, there's a big focus on parking lots, surface parking. It varies by location and land use. There is an interest to preserve and protect more trees, and we'll be exploring kind of an additional component of internal trees, how to look at preserving and protecting trees on private property from a non-parking lot perspective. And again, the major theme for this area of the tree article would be to clarify and provide simple, streamlined guidance on how to comply with requirements.
Tim, Tony has asked a question in chat. Can we
oh, sure.
Tony for a second?
Hi, I don't want to get in the weeds about this. I just want to make a very quick point about street trees and my desire that somehow appropriately that you take into account the standards that NCDOT has around street trees. And in fact, I just got a situation yesterday where a state legislature handed me and said, this is your problem, a file for a subdivision around here that had street trees that were installed pursuant to the city's standards, but that differ from NCDOT's standards. And so the roads, I guess, are not within the city, but they're not acceptable to NCDOT. So now the people in the subdivision are stranded with respect to their roads, and NCDOT won't take over the roads because the trees are not, among other things, the trees are not to their standards. So I would just make that point and ask that at least you consider that kind of situation as you prepare this section of the ordinance.
Thanks, Tony. That's a really good point. And we have considered that, and staff is aware of some of the existing challenges and struggles of subdivisions in the city's ETJ area. Looking forward, I don't think we have a plan today to really go into detail, but about this proposed ordinance concept, but that there is a proposed concept coming that would really get to the heart of preventing those challenging realities for subdivisions, but also for all types of permitting scenarios, commercial sites, urban sites, more rural, single-family subdivision sites. There is a challenge, there is a requirement the city has to plant street trees, and many times it's an NCDOT public right-of-way. So we're going to propose some language that provides extra guidance and flexibility for development customers on how they can meet that requirement and avoid issues down the road for HOAs or property owners. So it's a big concern. It's a big issue out there. And I also want to clarify is that when it's required to be planted in state road right-of-way, NCDOT requires the city to be the actual permittee. So it's an interesting kind of step-by-step process where the city is requiring perimeter trees to be planted, street trees, and NCDOT right away on the development customer. But NCDOT turns and says, okay, if you want to plant these trees or require them to be planted, City of Charlotte, you have to be the one who applies for the permit. So we definitely have a strong connection and responsibility and liability there that we want to make sure that in the future, Tony, that we get it right, because right now it needs to be fixed. So again, I appreciate that. Yeah, so let's move on to the next slide. So tree save. Tree save is often one of the most focused and kind of conflicting or controversial issues to manage, whether it's a big permitting thing or just kind of a high level policy thing. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about some of the proposed ordinance concepts for tree save. Right now, the tree ordinance looks at general tree save requirements kind of in two ways: a commercial and residential. And residential really means single family subdivisions. Everything else, including multifamily type residential, townhomes and things like that, are considered commercial. And that top bullet, you can see that there's a difference in the percentage of land area required for each type of development type. And there's a great number of opportunities, or excuse me, objectives that we're going to be looking at changing for tree save. And Andrew's going to talk a little bit more throughout the presentation about the main themes, but alignment is a big one. Trying to align within the article and with other articles in the UDO, and just kind of streamlining terminology and consistency. There is a focus, increased focus on preservation of high value trees. Also a large focus on providing flexibility and the opportunity for innovative solutions for challenging permitting or site issues. Yeah, so I think we can move on, or do we need to stop and take any questions?
No, we have a couple of questions coming in on the NCDOT stuff, and I see one from John we may want to take later, but I think we'll get into some of these questions throughout the presentation. So we can start in on the themes. Kind of like you mentioned, Tim, alignment is a big theme. And so what you see here is just sort of a summary of the themes that we're going to be presenting today. There are going to be a lot of changes in this article, and we thought it was best to present it based on 5 buckets, really, of areas that we are making adjustments to the standards. And so the first one is alignment. Second one, you see tree save has a strike through. It's really, and we'll get into detail what this means, but going away from strictly tree save and allowing some green area sort of alternatives, mirroring some of what we see other cities do, but fitting that to the Charlotte model as well. It's going to be a little bit of a shift in the approach, and I think that'll be a really interesting slide for our committee to explore this morning. But 3, streamlining internal trees, and then residential infill. And what we mean by infill, for those of you that aren't familiar with terminology, is just sort of single lot residential projects. Today, the tree ordinance really regulates at the subdivision level, and so we're looking at some standards to get into somewhat the residential infill stuff, and we'll talk more in detail as we get there. But Tim, you can add anything if you want.
Yeah, just a little bit. Just want to make sure that folks understand that tree save is still going to be there. Tree save will be one of the options for customers if they qualify for it to meet the green area requirement. So what's currently known as the tree save requirement, one of those big of the 3 buckets, it's still going to be there. Green area is going to be the new name. And I don't think we're 100% set on that term, but green area is what we're going with right now. We keep with that. Tree save will be one of the options to meet that, again, if you qualify. Right. So it's still there. It's still going to be a core common option and requirement in place, but there's going to be more, there's going to be a broader set of options to meet the green area requirement. So that was it.
All right, we can go to the next slide. So what you'll see in this presentation throughout is kind of a TCAP stamp that we put into the presentation where there was a TCAP recommended or comprehensive plan policy. And throughout, we're going to really do some work to show kind of what we're working from and what in the comprehensive plan is driving some of the goals that we're or some of the adjustments that we're making based on the goals in the comprehensive plan. So you see them here. There's kind of three main policies that we're working from. One, update development regulations. We know that Charlotte already faces a lot of development pressure. And so as that continues to develop, we want to have a policy in place to, make sure that we have the tree canopy and the natural area that we need to sustain that growth. And secondly, prioritize preservation of large, healthy, mature trees. It's something that we heard a lot in TCAP. People really wanted to see those, large, healthy, mature trees be preserved where possible. And so we're trying to get to that in some of the changes that we're making here. And then thirdly, just understanding that there are conflicts at times that compete where maybe one policy says, we need a sidewalk or we need a certain width of a street, and their sites are only so big at times. And so we're really trying to bake in some level of flexibility, some level of value-based decisions when there are conflicts in sort of our policies. So trying to be thoughtful about that is something that we're trying to bake into the ordinance as part of some of these changes. And so at a high level, the three alignment changes that we want to talk about today is one, the triggers. We've talked a lot about that on some of these OAC calls where but what we mean by triggers are sort of site characteristics that will trigger a review in the process of development. We're looking at adjusting some of those natural area requirements. As we said on our post-construction call, the post-construction stormwater ordinance previously had some regulations to require natural area to be put on site as a stormwater mitigation measure. And some of that was long before we had a tree ordinance. And so as we now have a tree ordinance, we're looking to remove that from post-construction requirements and translate that into trees. And so there's a number of added benefits to doing that, and we'd be glad to discuss that. But that's a big shift, I think, that is important. And then moving cluster development incentives into the zoning standards. If you are familiar with what that was, it really was a zoning type regulation. And so it didn't really make sense to keep that in the tree regulations. And so instead we're carrying that over, but just in a different section of the ordinance. So this is a big one, and I'll start it off, Tim, and you can jump in as you see fit. But the article triggers, you can see what we have today, and then you can see what we're proposing to go to in the future on the slide. Today, we really focus on new development, additions to sites that add parking, that add an adjustment to a facade. And so I think we've heard that before on OAC that sometimes today, if you're putting in a new window, you may trigger the tree article or the tree ordinance today. And then there's also an additional 5%, 1,000 square foot building footprint addition in the current ordinance. And so what we were going is to really simplify this to say new construction of a principal structure, addition of built upon area. So if you're going vertical, that's not addition of built upon area. If you're going to expand your building footprint wider by 5% or 1,000 square feet, there's going to be a tree review, and then approval of a subdivision. So that carries what we do today really in residential. We regulate all residential subdivisions for compliance with the tree ordinance. And as you see in the note below, we're not looking to expand the tree save and the tree planting requirements to apply to anything other than that. We are going to continue to apply those to residential subdivisions, and the smaller single lot residential projects will still be exempt from tree save and the tree planting requirements. But we're looking into proposing, additional planting requirements that are somewhat different than the other requirements for other forms of development. So, Tim, I'll let you jump in as needed.
Sure, and thanks, Andrew. Oh, sorry, somebody else. One clarification. The tree save requirement is definitely not intended to be applied to individual lots. And the planting requirement sometimes that goes along with tree save. That's what we're talking about here. But we will cover a potential perimeter street tree planting requirement for individual lots, residential infill, later on. But I just want to echo some of the other things that Andrew said about on the left there, the current ordinance. Historically, we've heard a lot of questions, not always complaints, but just questions about why do you have a parking space quantity trigger? Why is there a facade trigger? What's the intent, purpose, and history behind that? So that was part of the decision making on trying to transition to what we have on the right here.
Let me see. I'm reading through some of the questions. I think we can probably go to the next slide. Well, let's actually go back. I see some questions about some of these things. I see a question from Eric. Will the align theme be tied to certain zoning districts, especially infill development, so more dense districts having relaxed conditions? I think by your question, Eric, and maybe you'll have to unmute to see if we're getting at what you want, but are you asking if zoning will be sort of the differentiating factor between where conditions are more flexible?
A part of it, I've noticed everything seems to be due to more, it looks like permitting or approval of subdivisions, and not necessarily being triggered by different zoning districts. And I know that during the comp plan and some of the criticism through city council about place types and goals, conflicting goals, especially they keep bringing up trees, is I feel like that might be one way of tackling it, so the goal can't be blanketed across the whole city. It has to be varied in different areas, and therefore that areas could be dependent upon zoning districts. And of course, the larger, less dense zoning districts are going to look completely different from like your neighborhood 1 and F's or neighborhood 2s, right? So I was just wondering if there's a way that could be worked in beyond just the new construction permits and approval of subdivisions, or if the built upon area changes.
Yeah.
I know it's a little bit different, but just was looking at how somebody could easily look at something and say, hey, this is zoned in this, so I already know it's going to be a certain standard in the ordinance with the trees, and how they're going to require perimeter trees compared to tree save. And if I'm in a different district, look it up and what that's going to be like. And then maybe there might be some, it looks like different existing things as well. So I don't know how that all fits together, but that was where my question was going.
Yeah, so definitely. The trigger itself in terms of, so when you're developing a site, whether you need to, comply with the tree article, that will not entirely run off of zoning. It's really about the conditions, about what you're developing, but how to comply certainly will be driven by zoning and place types. So if you remember the place types or the zoning discussion we had months ago, every place type is tied to a certain set of zoning districts. And so we're really trying to make it simple in how you can comply. So say a neighborhood 1, for example, that's going to have a very different set of options that you can use in the current or in the new article to comply than say a centers district. Our centers districts are going to be much more dense, much more. So where you can put in a green roof, for example, as an option to comply is going to be very different, whether that's in a center or a neighborhood. So, that the simple answer is yes, zoning will be considered, but in terms of for the applicability of the article, that's not really the main trigger that we're going to be using. Although there is that one exemption for neighborhood 1 place types that will exempt neighborhood 1 that is not a subdivision from the tree save and the tree planting requirements that would apply to like a subdivision or maybe a commercial development project. I'm seeing some specific questions, and so I see one from Thomas about will these triggers apply to single-family teardowns? So, Tim, I don't know what you want to say. Yes and no. I mean, how do you want to broach that one?
So yes, in my view, we're going to introduce in a moment here proposed ordinance concepts for single-family lot, infill type teardowns. I think that would fall under kind of new construction of a principal structure. We do still have a little bit of work to figure out how we're going to approach that in permitting. What type of threshold. Is it just construction of a new principal structure? Is it going to be, demolition related? We certainly don't want to get into like trades, permits, electrical and plumbing and things like that at all. But yeah, there is an intention to have development requirements apply to that infill type of development. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So we do want to clarify that what we're trying to clarify here is, and that statement at the bottom of the slide is the approach to the infill, to that teardown scenario, would differ than the kind of current development that we regulate now, single-family subdivision and commercial. All the requirements that apply to those types would not apply to the infill. We're trying to differentiate.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get certainly into more detail on that, but I see there's some support from Thomas in the chat for something like that. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. But anyway, I see a comment from Nate, and Nate is the one that's always talking about triggers on the call. So maybe it would be, so the question that he submitted was streamlining triggers is needed. I like the new structure, but would like to understand the BUA trigger versus other ordinances, right? I can't speak to streets and sidewalks. I'm not as familiar with their chapter, although we did reference those in coming up with the trigger numbers. Post-construction is going to be a higher trigger. I believe that they're going with 5,000 square feet as the trigger for post-construction requirements. But we didn't feel the need to go that high with these standards because we were getting rid of some of the facade changes and some of the parking lot additional requirements that we wanted to go more toward where you're adding a building footprint or you're adding impervious surface to your lot. We saw that as the opportunity to add trees that just made more sense. And so we didn't want to adjust the built upon area requirement from the current standards to maybe alter the standards in that way. But I believe it would be similar to how how that trigger works today, right, Tim? I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. And then, switching, to the BUA approach, there's definitely some alignment, theme in that consideration with, those other two disciplines you mentioned. This is definitely an area that we were really interested in having some feedback from this group and, from the public to see if the threshold, the 5% or 1,000 square feet is appropriate. Does that capture enough? Does that not capture enough? Is it too restrictive? Is it too lax? That type of thing.
Yeah. I see a lot of chat about NCDOT stuff, and I think, Laura, you're doing a good job of answering some of those. And I'll just say that, I don't know if we're going to get into too much detail on some of those things today, but it is something we're considering. So I'll just say that and leave it there, unless, Laura, you want to take time to add anything to that.
I'll just briefly say we're working in the tree article, as well as in the subdivision streets and infrastructure article, to respect NCDOT and provide that flexibility and recognition that what we may require through the UDO as a base standard may conflict with NCDOT. We don't want people to have to wonder what do they do then, or spend a lot of time on it. So we're alternative standards when that conflict occurs, so that will be the ordinance instead of having to work with it outside of the ordinance to resolve it. So we agree with you guys. We'll be interested to see if you guys think that we've accomplished that or not with the draft.
With that, I'm going to say we go to the next slide so we can get through all of it. So this is a biggie. Theme 2, we're going to focus on tree save, what is traditionally today tree save, and how we're going to a green area approach. The goals that we're really looking at here are listed out on the screen, but I think the essence of this is we really kind of the second bullet there. We want to improve the quality of tree canopy to ensure it lasts. We heard that a lot in TCAP. We believe that we really want to make sure that our trees get at that quality that our community is looking for to ensure, all sorts of considerations for sustainability and community character. We're working toward that, and I think that the shift that we're going to make in going from tree safe to green area allows some of those sites where there's a lot more going on. Think of your centers throughout our community. Allow them some more flexible options to comply with the tree requirements, but at the same time, making sure that our residential areas and our communities are preserving the level of trees that we need in our sort of areas with a lot more yards and a lot more open space. So yeah, I don't have too much more to add, but we can go to the next slide. The key changes, and I'll walk through them at a high level and let you jump in, Tim. First, like I said earlier, natural area requirements moving out of post-construction. We're going to translate that into trees by increasing residential tree save to sort of rebalance that to make sure that we're not losing the type of natural area that's required to on site. Secondly, tree save will be redefined as green area. And one of the compliance options in that green area approach is going to be traditional tree save. But with that will be a menu of other flexible options. Additionally, there'll be extra credit opportunities. So if you're providing trees that are of higher quality, and we'll talk about what that means, you'll get sort of I want to say we call it extra credit, but it could also be considered like a reduction in the amount of area that you have to save. So something that we heard in TCAP and from a lot of folks that are on this call. So thirdly, updating payment in lieu value to current tax value. I believe right now we are tied to an outdated tax value, and so we want to update that. And then fourthly, remove urban site exemptions. Today, there's a lot of sites in Charlotte that are exempt from tree save because they're really dense, and we're going to look to change that to sort of align and be consistent in our applicability. And then allow more options for offsite tree save. We just kind of see those two working in tandem, where there's some more urban sites that may have little area to preserve. They're going to have a lot of options and different options for saving trees offsite to comply. So Tim, with that, I'll hand it off to you.
Sure. Just to provide a little bit more detail about the specifics. I'm going to start with the bottom bullet there, offsite tree save. Anyone who's familiar with that currently in the tree ordinance on any level may be aware that it really is not a viable option. I think it's been used one time, maybe a couple times in the 10 years that it's been in the ordinance. It's not a real option. So what we're looking to do is to completely rework it and simplify it and make it a real viable option to increase the flexibility and just the, I would say, creative way that customers may be able to meet their tree save requirement. So specifically right now, offsite tree save requires that a tree save area on a different property be conveyed to a conservation entity fee simple. So the ownership has to legally change to a conservation group, and then another conservation entity has to hold a conservation easement on that property. And this doesn't really work in conservation management. That's typically not how it works. And there's a whole host of challenges for development customers about timing and when there are due diligence and financial things getting in order. It just doesn't work. And it only could work if it was massive land area. So the only two conservation entities really up till now that would work for this would be the Catawba Lands Conservancy. And they traditionally have wanted very large, they want to partner, but they also want very large properties to partner with. It's part of their mission. And that works well if there's a scenario where a customer could find that, or Mecklenburg County. And Mecklenburg County has been a great partner with some city programs, but it really hasn't worked well for this option. It's not a knock on the county or Catawba Lands Conservancy. It's just the way the option was written. So going forward, that'll be stripped down, and the customers will have the ability to provide offsite tree save in a proximity area. We need to define that. We want a lot of feedback on what a proximity to this kind of sending site, developing site would be. So right now, on-site tree save has to be protected during construction. At the end, it has to be platted and recorded with deed restrictions. And that's going to be one of the options for offsite tree save. Is you can use a tree save on another property, platted, recorded with the required current deed restrictions, no additional conservation easement level type of protection. There likely has to be some type of verification that if that property owner, the receiving property for the offsite tree save, has to agree if it's whoever it is. So that's method one we think we could implement on day one. Also related to that, which will not be available on day one of implementation of the UDO, is another method where customers could utilize a city managed, it's not really a land banking program, but it's similar to that, where the city would have some kind of ready to go of interested property owners out there that want to protect their land. And the city would work to have a conservation process. We already have a number of sites in our land bank, so to speak, available. And if they meet the criteria for proximity and quality, customers may have an option to utilize that in-house kind of land banking offsite tree save. A third option, which will take some time as well to develop, would be donating tree save area to the city's tree canopy preservation program. So that's a little bit of detail about that specific offsite tree save option.
That was good.
Urban site exemptions, that's a big proposal. Any site that's in a transit station area that may be exempt per the current tree ordinance, this proposed concept was to completely remove the exemptions for sites like that. Those sites would have access to green area options. This third bullet from the bottom, payment in lieu. That's not technically a ordinance amendment. That's a guideline. We're talking about the capped value for payment in lieu. It's a very detailed, complex formula that calculates the payment in lieu fee. So if a development customer qualifies for that, they have to pay a fee based on the acreage of the developing site multiplied by the standard 15% kind of factor, and then the land value per acre for their developing property. Now there's a cap in the ordinance that says it can't exceed a certain level. And that cap right now is $80,100 per acre. That cap is based on county tax appraisal data from the 2000s, the early aughts. So it's really dated. And so the payment in lieu value, the cap is going to be updated. And, it's going to increase significantly based on just how Charlotte has evolved since 2000 to now, property values, and it's just a land value. We're not changing conceptually how that formula or requirement would work, but the cap value is going to increase, much higher than 80,100. That is proposed to be around $196,000 based on some initial analysis work completed by the planning department. So that's a significant increase. And I think that's a lot of detail I just threw out there. So let me stop, Andrew. And what type of questions should we take, or should we move on?
Yeah, let's present the rest of this. There's a couple of good questions coming in, and we'll come back to them. But let's present some of the concepts, and then we'll come back to answer questions once we get through green area. Move to the next slide, Alan. So this is getting at the flexibility of menu of options that we're talking about. Today, we work, for those of you that are familiar, we work off of centers, quarters, and wedges. And then there's also a consideration of your zoning. And centers, quarters, and wedges is just sort of a map that shows specific areas of Charlotte that are subject to different requirements for tree purposes. That's what it does. It just kind of shows you if you're in a wedge, which is most of Charlotte, believe you're required to comply with, the 10 or the full tree save percentage. But if you're a center or a corridor, there's some more flexibility and there's more options, but it gets complicated when you add in all the different layers of zoning and the things that you have to consider on the site. But the new approach is going to shift just to place types. There will be some consideration of zoning, as you see here. So if you're in a campus district, you're going to be in the tier 1 level of flexibility, which is the most flexibility we're proposing. If you're in that IC2, which is the more densely developed campus, if you're in other districts other than an IC2, you'd be down in tier 3, which makes sense considering where most of these are and the sites, the characteristics of each of those different sites. But essentially, the way we're going to operate this is tier 1 would be given the full menu of options. Tier 2 would also be given this full menu of options, but sort of the options won't count as much. There's sort of an element of I don't know how to explain this. There's going to be an element of a multiplier that is if you provide 1,000 square foot green roof in an urban regional activity center, our most dense center, that 1,000 square feet is going to count toward 1,000 square feet of your tree save. But if you provide, say, 1,000 square feet green roof in a commercial place type, there's going to be a multiplier tied to that, where, say, that green roof will count toward 500 square feet. I don't know what the exact multiplier is, and we're still working on those numbers, but essentially it will decrease the value of sort of what that can count toward. And that's really just to make sure that our less developed sites or less dense sites, still require a high number of trees. They may be incentivized to save more just traditional tree save. It's just a way, and we're following a model that we found out at Washington, D.C. and Seattle that sort of use that multiplier approach. And if you go to the next slide, this might provide more detail about what we're talking about. This is the menu of options that we're currently thinking through and currently setting the draft up with. You see some familiar options in there. So what's not included here and would be included is just traditional tree save, replanting trees if trees were removed, planting trees where there's less than 15% canopy, amenitized tree save. So that's really kind of trees and tree pits and sort of, they're not your traditional just trees planted in the ground. There's some more urban elements and some other things that can go into those tree save areas that you maybe wouldn't find in a traditional tree save. Offsite mitigation is something that we allow today. We're going to carry that over, and then payment in lieu as well. But where we're adding some wrinkles is to say, you know, if you want to plant a green roof with maybe a more shallow depth, that can count, but there will be a multiplier tied to that would maybe reduce the value that it would count toward your tree save. Green walls are another good example. You could put that on the side of a building. It's going to help to mitigate a lot of the effects of, you know, air quality and provide sort of a nice aesthetic to some buildings, but that's not going to count as much as toward your tree save as if you had just gone out and saved 15% of the site. So can you guys go back? I don't know if Tim, if you want to add anything.
No, I think that's good for now. I mean, we'll stop
Okay.
in a second and kind of just reassess how much, you know, questions and where we need to kind of, you know, explain more detail.
Yeah.
No, I think we can move on to the next slide.
Okay.
We'll probably
Sorry,
pause.
Alan.
There's
You can go back.
a lot of talk going on in the chat box. So.
Yeah. So the other element of this is going to be an extra credit element. So if you're providing tree save at, you know, say if you're replanting trees at 48 trees per acre, and that's greater, that, you know, the current standard is 36 trees per acre. So if you add density of your tree planting to 48 trees per acre, you could get extra credit for that. If you preserve a specimen tree, which is just a larger tree, I don't know, I think it was, yeah, you see this, the size there, 20 inches or 10 inches for your understory trees, there's going to be extra credit applied there. And that's something that we have in the ordinance, I think, today, but carrying that over. And then the sort of the three other elements that we're adding to this, and this came a lot out of TCAP, I think, with some of the way that we were looking at our ordinances, was if you're going to save tree save, you know, directly abutting or directly beside another tree conservation area. So say a neighboring development has tree save beside you. If you continue that sort of patch of trees and you connect the two tree save areas, we're going to count that for more towards your tree save. If you add tree save in along a waterway or, you know, some of those stormwater buffers, we're going to, you know, sort of allow extra credit for something like that as well. Because we just know that these trees provide a number of ecological benefits and, you know, in addition to that, steep slopes as well. So Tim, if you want to jump in and talk more, go for it.
Sure. Yeah. Just add some more detail to the items, the elements listed in the table there. Tree save on individual lots there at the top. The ability, I just want to clarify, the ability to provide tree save, for example, in a single family subdivision project on individual lots, that's still going to be there. I believe we're intending to say here that infill development that triggers some of the new requirements we're going to propose in a moment, tree save is not required in those scenarios. Those infill lots may have already tree save on there from an earlier, you know, time when they were part of a subdivision development project, but new infill triggers aren't going to require additional tree save requirements. So I wanted to hopefully that is clear. And the replanting trees at 48 trees per acre, the second element down, that increased density will have a kind of a forestry kind of understory species element attached to it. So the density will have a targeted approach that looks to get towards where it makes sense, kind of natural forest types in the North Carolina Piedmont area. So you may have 36 trees per acre of large mature trees, and those, you know, in between trees that get up to the 48 per acre quantity, they may be comprised of, you know, traditional understory trees, redbuds, dogwood, etc. Yeah, so let me just move down the table there. Specimen trees, that's currently part of the ordinance now. It's going to be there again as kind of an extra, you know, credit. And again, you could also, as Andrew said earlier, the extra credit terminology really could also be used to, you think about, you get reduced tree save area requirement if you take advantage of these elements.
Yeah, and we have that. I think the next couple slides might help clear that.
Okay.
Up too.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, so let's yeah. So here's a good example here. You see the example site dimensions there.
Yeah.
This gets into single family here. So Andrew, I don't know if you want to start this off here.
This is very rudimentary and simple to just give you a general idea of the approach we're going to take. So yes, tree save in residential areas is 10% today, and we're looking to increase that to 15%. And so that means more tree area. But if you go to the next slide, Alan, the idea would be to, if you as a developer or builder were willing to, locate that tree save along the waterway and make the design work to preserve trees in that area, you see that there's a reduced area that's required to be saved. But we know that if you save those trees in that area, they're providing a number of benefits, reducing the surface temperature of the water, filtering pollutants, doing all sorts of good things. And so we if you're going to locate your tree save in an area that's higher value, there'll be less of a requirement. So I think that in a picture form is a little easier, maybe hopefully to understand what that extra credit is going to look like.
Right. So you could multiply a certain area of tree save by, we're not showing this presentation here because we thought just putting all these factors and multipliers on the screen may be even more confusing. But for this example, for locating your tree save next to existing tree save on an adjacent lot, of course, you may not have that opportunity. You may not be next to a waterway, but those are situations where you can multiply those areas, and the square footage that's required would be reduced based on its location adjacent to these targeted areas. Steep slope, planting mix, 48 trees per acre density.
Yeah.
Could we go back one slide? Just wanted to. Okay, so I didn't want to gloss over this because this is big, but you can see on the left there, 10%. This is the 15% on the right. That's indicative of the proposed regulation to increase single-family subdivision tree save percentage requirements to 15%. Currently, it's at 10%. The proposed article is saying 15%. So wanted to make sure we talked about that because that's very certain that's going to be a very interesting discussion point for many development customers. So, and that connects to TCAP recommendations, comprehensive plan policy, that really is looking at the significant decline of tree canopy in single family areas. That's where the greatest tree canopy currently exists. And it's also been from 2012 to 2018, the greatest source of tree canopy decline.
I think what's on the next slide? I don't really know what's after this one. Okay, you can back up if possible. Let's take some questions. Lots of good thoughts in here. Let me see. Okay, so way back when, we got a question from Dave Wiggins that says, how does tree save / green area apply where a site plan shows a tree save area where there are no trees currently? Are there tree planting requirements? I'm gonna let Tim answer that one.
Sure. So it depends. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on what tree save options the site qualifies for based on a number of things that could be location within the center, corridor, and wedge framework, zoning. It could be transit station area. If a site does not qualify for any options and the only method available to meet their tree save requirement is to provide on-site tree save, then that site would be really limited to starting with looking at what's on there already for tree canopy. And, the intent is to preserve existing trees on those type of sites if they are existing. However, that's challenging depending on where they may be located. And I will say in the future, quality will be a component of determining preservation requirements. I think I saw a question or a comment in the chat about requiring that 150% planting back if any trees are cut down. So there's flexibility now that allows sites to remove existing trees if it's a significant challenging site constraint type scenario. If the only option is to have on-site tree save, there is ability to remove trees and plant back. Right now, there's a punitive component of that. You have to plant back at 150% of the standard requirement. What's important to note is that includes area too, right? So that's difficult, of course, because it's not just 150% more trees. It's also provide that much extra area on the site. So we're considering in the proposed article to have more flexibility based on looking, to the quality theme of tree save. What is there now? If it's invasive tree species that, yes, are providing benefits and quality, but they're undesirable and there's some negative components to that, should there be a punitive 150 component there? I think in some scenarios that should not, that shouldn't be the way we go. So we're considering, that approach where it's not the punitive component depending on what's there. On other sites where there are options, provide offsite, payment in lieu, green roof. Those sites have the ability to clear the site and go back and plant trees. So they may have an existing forested area on their site. If they qualify for the options, they can clear those trees and replant a new tree save area with brand new trees. In some scenarios, there's that 150% requirement. In some areas, there are not. There's a lot of details. I was deep in the weeds of the ordinance there, but I wanted to provide specifics. Hopefully that answered the question.
That's where we're living these days, deep in the dark annals of the tree ordinance. So no, I think that's helpful. I've seen a couple of comments, and I think it's probably just good to talk about all of them. Matt and Joe, I think both of you had said something about smaller sites, and that generally today there's less flexibility for tree save on these smaller sites. And it would be great to build more flexibility and allow a land area threshold similar to post-construction requirements. And I think we talked about the triggers that we're not going to, I don't think that we're right now proposing to go align the triggers of post-construction and trees. Although if that's if there's a strong desire from the OAC, it certainly is something we consider and talk about. But I think it's a good question there about smaller sites. Is there any sort of additional flexibility that's going to be granted for smaller sites where, maybe existing trees aren't or are harder to fit in with building footprints and stuff like that?
Yeah, I don't think that I don't mean that the triggers should align, because I think the goals of the two different ordinance sections are different. But I think the idea is, imagine a 1 acre lot that's, destined for some degree of density, and then it has a 48-inch oak tree right smack in the middle of it. What do? I know there's emphasis placed on retention of the existing tree canopy, but it may render that site nearly undevelopable in a way that the market is asking it to be, if that makes sense. And it's weird, because there's always the economic component of trying to be able to realize value out of land. And so, there are times when, well, just put a single family house on it and move on isn't the answer. But that may be the only answer as you try to weave the way this ordinance is written with the way the other ordinances are written. I think,
Mhm.
you know, I mean, because we do a lot of infill sites that are small, strangely shaped, or like I said, you know, maybe they had a house on them that was built back in the 20s, and so all the trees were planted right around the house, and so there are no trees around the edge, and there are great big trees right where the house used to be, you know. And I think it would benefit urban forestry in Charlotte to have some sort of relief valve, or hey, we have an odd situation here, can we figure something out that provides a creative solution when the text doesn't present one.
So I think we definitely can improve and clarify and provide better criteria in the article in the UDO on the threshold or those scenarios on when a site kind of meets that criteria and should be, you know, considered for I'll say site constraints, you know, flexibility. I think urban forestry in the city and other areas right now, we work really closely with customers to try to work through that. And it's challenging, right? Because we don't have really great, clear criteria. There's language in there that is general. And so in the proposed article, we will see a little bit more specific criteria that will provide better guidance to staff and customers on those scenarios when they meet, and should, you know, have that additional consideration for flexibility. But it's challenging, right? Because it's balancing that economic development, you know, value, product, kind of market driven, what's the best use and fit for this property with preservation of ecological assets. And it's really changing. So we're trying to walk the line of balancing all of that with, you know, preservation requirements, but still enough flexibility so sites can develop, and not just develop something, but develop something that makes sense economically, but also just from, you know, people are moving here, they want to live in certain places. It makes sense for, you know, just general quality of life interests.
And it's a slippery slope, I know. And I think you guys do a pretty good job of trying to be practical, you know. And when we were working on that rewrite related to the urban districts, there was a lot of practicality that got added in. And I thought that was a good solution, where we are looking at, okay, when this hits the ground, how does it actually work in execution? So I don't know. I mean, it would be nice, because I know you guys have run into it where the ordinance doesn't allow us X, and we don't even know what X is yet because this thing hasn't been approved. It would be nice if there was any sort of, you know, the urban forest, the city arborist, because like the subdivision administrator has certain latitude to interpret things certain ways. The zoning administrator has certain latitude to interpret things certain ways. You know, like street connectivity and things like that. Those are built into the ordinance that if it makes no sense because this is dropping off a cliff, you don't have to extend a street that way. And there's flexibility built in. It'd be nice if there's something in here that would give you the tools to work with the design team to come up with a creative solution when things get sticky. That's all.
That's a good point. I appreciate the feedback. And let me add that the flexibility and practicality with the urban site amendment from 2019, which created the ability for amenitized tree area, which is essentially a really advanced, flexible tree save approach. That's there, that's staying. We do have some work to kind of better define exactly what is allowed in those scenarios. So part of this effort, hopefully before the UDO is implemented and adopted, we'll have some land development standards and guidelines that show more specifically what is allowed in those amenitized tree areas. And to the other point about having some better guidance for administrative flexibility, right now the tree ordinance differs from some of those other disciplines and their ordinances. And there's a great deal of administrative authority for the urban forester or the city arborist, and it's not defined very well. So we're considering kind of really focusing in on what that is, limiting it, but better clarifying what flexibility, for some zoning elements, I'm outside my lane here, but I believe there's like a 5% kind of flexible, move a side yard by this percentage or that percentage type of thing. And we're trying to get to that level with the administrative authority for those tree ordinance policy leaders, the arborist or the forester. So for one main reason, it's understood from kind of day one. If you qualify for this kind of site constraint flexibility, here's the limit of what that is. And we can start collectively working for solutions in those situations that qualify. I definitely don't want everyone to start developing and designing based on the last resort scenario. But when folks qualify for that, that's as far as we can go. And here's the flexible criteria regarding. I'm not sure how 5% leeway works for tree planting requirements or preservation requirements, but we'll propose that in the draft.
Yeah, and I see Eric and Walter's hands up. I don't know who had it up first, but I see Eric at the top. So Eric, do you want to jump in?
I think Walter was first. He could go.
Walter.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate that. I just wanted to get a clarification. Tim or Andrew, one or the other of you just a short while ago was talking about thresholds and trigger points and things along the way with different components within what might evolve into the tree section of the UDO. But I thought I heard whoever it was say that right now there's not an effort to coordinate those trigger points like with the stormwater, the PTCO, or it's not called that now, but you know what I'm talking about. Did I misunderstand that? Because it would seem like there would be eminently improved advantages in terms of coordination and problem solving if, without throwing the total purpose for each individual set of rules out the window, the trigger points would be fairly well coordinated. So if you knew that you were at X, you were going to have to do both, as opposed to you're at Y and you have to do the tree part, but not the stormwater part, or vice versa. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that's not to say that, and that I think that was probably me. That's not to say that we aren't coordinating or that there isn't that consideration. I think we'd like to align them as much as possible. I just think that they are different. They're different ordinances, and so yes, certainly there's going to be some sites under our current framework where you're going to trigger you're going to trigger trees, but you won't trigger post construction. And I imagine I don't know exactly what that would look like, but there may be some where the inverse is true. But I think the two things I can point to is one, the natural area requirements coming out of post construction is the one area that I think is the most, the biggest opportunity for us to align, because right now there's requirements for, sites to preserve just existing vegetation on site, and that can be a grass field, that can be, whatever is there. And so what we're going to do is shifting that, and that has been done in coordination with stormwater.
But that's, again, one of the selling points of making the editorial choice to put all your ordinances together is a process which would go through into the greatest extent possible, eliminate conflicts and coordinate processes and so on and so forth. The idea would be to simplify the whole thing, as opposed to focusing, or each group primarily focusing on their chimney, as opposed to there being a manifold where everything goes into the same manifold and are processed the same way. That has been one of the reasons that people have advocated UDOs for the past 25 years.
Mm-hmm. And I will say,
Andrew, can I
Yeah,
jump
go ahead.
in a little bit? We certainly agree with that to the extent possible, and we're continuing, as we're working on different pieces of that, trying to do that. I think sometimes the challenge is, Walter, what would become a reason for doing something in one part of the UDO may not align with the reason and rough proportionality in some of our legal tests in another part of the UDO. So we're challenged by that, by trying to do what you're saying to the extent possible, and where it really does make sense. But if you look at, say, sedimentation and erosion control, so we're talking about, you know, dirt under construction running into a stream, the reason that you would have those is very different than maybe another regulation, another part of the ordinance. And our concern has been that if we try to totally make those align, we're going to go naturally to the lowest common denominator, and we might be invoking a requirement before it's really needed at a level of development where it's really not needed. So I think we certainly are going to continue to be open, and especially once everyone see the draft of how can we align these. But I just wanted to mention some of the challenges we're having in doing that and trying to really have regulations, a regulation that relates to an impact or a desire to accomplish something, as opposed to sometimes artificially aligning them.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Laura. I think we all agree and understand, as I said in my statement, that each of these sets of regulations is there for their own purpose and their own reason. I was simply observing and hoping that the advantages that we can gain by the publication of a UDO would include the ability to more closely coordinate processes when that might be beneficial. I'm not suggesting that we put a silt fence around everybody that wants to mow their yard. So I get the idea. I'm sort of singing the same hymn in favor of the UDO and its ability to give us the time and the focus to look for these ways to improve both the process and the product in the context of all the other things that we have to deal with. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have the same goal.
Yeah. Eric?
Yeah, I just wanted to, and it's difficult because we're only seeing pieces of this in slide form and not all together. But my earlier question, we talked about with place types and triggers or, you know, different goals, I think is exactly what I see in the tiers, except that's only for tree save. So it's just, and then relating back to what Walter just said, kind of bringing it together. This is more like, you know, in those more urban areas in tier 1, tier 2, you know, maybe the tree save, you know, it counts as the perimeter, saving perimeter trees, and then you don't save anything because it is in those tier 1, tier 2, you know, just providing the flexibility and breaking it out and overlapping different segments and with different categories of trees, you know, like the perimeter trees versus tree save, instead of keeping them isolated in their own little thing, that, you know, we give that flexibility, and that more flexibility is geared towards those tier 1, tier 2, and then it kind of will probably change as we get out of those first 2 tiers, or maybe tier 3, you know, something like that. But basically my idea, what I was talking about, was basically how you set it up, but expanding that beyond just a tree save, and or wrapping it all up and simplifying into those tiers like that.
Yeah, we certainly want to do that as much as possible, and we're continually working toward that. So I think we're on the same page as you, and you know, we show what that looked like in terms of the tree save options, and that's where I think the idea was born, because right now we work under centers, quarters, and wedges, and you know, there's a lot of different things that go into the tree save calculation today, and so I think that's a good comment, and maybe we can look into how maybe planning requirements and perimeter trees are tied to those tiers, and I think we could get there. It just might take some creative thinking. But Tim, I saw you unmuted, so feel free to jump in.
I think you covered it well. I was actually going to see if we could see some other questions. I wanted to see if we could quickly just respond to, but if there's, you know, room for an interest in discussion, let's definitely do that. I see one from John Morris about a simple process, simple in quotes. So, if a developer has an area on an existing site, and he says we really need to focus on adding trees in existing areas, not just in new development. that can be dedicated to tree save, that area can offset tree save on another project. So yes, John, that's part of the intent behind reworking the offsite tree save is that I'm not speaking from a legal perspective, but I think theoretically that could be described as your own little land bank, you know. So if you have, let's say you have, I don't know, an acre of tree save on a site, and that site develops where you only need to provide a quarter acre of tree save, well, then you have 3/4 of tree save kind of left over, so to speak. I'm really generalizing here, so there could be a lot of other variables in place, but you have the ability potentially to utilize that extra tree save for other projects. We do really want some good feedback on a proximity requirement. We think there will likely be a proximity requirement for offsite tree save. The value of having, right now, you're allowed to do offsite tree save. It doesn't work, but if you did it, you could do it anywhere in the county. So we like the idea of having more of a defined proximity area. I know stormwater has something in their ordinance for mitigation that has the same watershed. I don't think we should take that approach, but there has to be some type of, it shouldn't be on the same street, but is it by place type? Is it by, it's a general half mile type of thing? But general, yes, that's part of the intent for this new offsite tree save option. Hopefully that answered your question, John.
And it just occurred to me that might be a good question we can ask about after the meeting is what sort of proximity, if you're going to do offsite tree save, how far away should that tree save be from the developed site, in your mind? We'll have some more detailed questions, I think, for everybody after the meeting, but it's a good comment for sure.
I saw one from Thomas as well about
Go ahead.
Green Roof. I want to touch on really quick we intend to not only allow that giant slab of sedum as the only, green roof reality that could occur. That definition will be expanded and broadened to include landscape areas. It's not up on the slide right now, but there was a slide about depth for 3 different kind of levels of green roof in the previous one. Yep, thank you. There on the left, see 2 to 4, 4 to 8 inches or deeper. Another element that we're considering is having a factor for plant quantity and type, so that there could be the ability to have a factor to help meet the square footage requirement that's based on not just how much square footage you have, but how many plants are included in those areas. So I think that's something we'll look to include as well. It's something that Seattle and some other cities do. They have a worksheet that goes through different types of landscape areas, and there's different factors for depth, plant quantity, plant quality. So there may be some extra credit available in that area as well, so to speak.
Yeah, we are a lot of good questions, and I'm making note of all of them, but we'll move on to theme 3 and just keep going because some of these might be answered through the rest of the presentation. Third theme is streamlining. We're going to be using more tables and charts. There have been several areas that have been, have done undergone a heavy reorganization. It's made it much more easy to understand. Simplifying language. There's several sections in the tree ordinance where we have like one statement that just kind of is repeated 7 times and slightly changed. And a lot of that's going to go away and make a much simpler ordinance. So we hope that gets toward what I think John was mentioning earlier, just a simpler process, more simple read. And then consolidating most of the tree, residential and commercial tree safe requirements. So just getting at that, we really want to have a similar process, similar requirements as much as we can between residential and commercial areas. And then center squares and wedges to place types. So I'm going to say next slide, and Tim, stop me if you want to jump in, but basically this is a sort of a snapshot of what we would do today. So today you can see a sort of example site that's in that highlighted light blue outline there. And it has a mud zoning and it's in a corridor. So you can see the purple streak that kind of runs through that map on the left. That's our corridors, and it runs along South Boulevard. And I think that's 77. But anyway, this is our example site. Now we'll go to the next slide. So today there's several sites that are exempt. You see those outlined in blue. The site that we're looking at is not exempt, so it would have to comply today. Go to the next slide, Alan. In the current framework, centers, corridors, and wedges different requirements. There's different options that are afforded to each different site, and depending on your zoning and where you are, it can lead to a lot of different things that you have to consider in development. So next slide. Special consideration, is in the ordinance today for urban districts, and those are listed out there. So UMUD, MUD, TOD, they're given additional levels of flexibility. That's just kind of note that the MUD would, the site would have some flexibility. They're not exempt, but they would have certain options that they could use other than traditional tree save. Next slide. So where we're going, just kind of outlining the two different approaches of what we do today and where we're going. Today we have all these sorts of considerations, and then in the future where we'd like to go is just a place types based approach. So as long as you know what your place type is, and you can read in the table what tier you're assigned to, going back to what we said earlier, tier 1 through 4 is given different levels of flexibility. You should very easily be able to understand what your requirements are on site, what you need to do, and just provide much more of a simple process for understanding the tree save requirements and lining up with the future land use map of place types. So I see a thumbs up from Eric. I think that's exactly what you were saying earlier. Just really trying to simplify. So internal trees. So our fourth theme, we heard this a lot in TCAP, and you can see the policy that we were sort of drawing from is on the right there, to prioritize the preservation of large, healthy, mature trees. A heritage tree is the term that we're using in the proposed standards to protect large, healthy, mature trees. Those are trees that are native to North Carolina and are larger than 30 inches DBH. If you're proposing to remove a heritage tree, there's going to be a mitigation option available. So payment will be a mitigation option, and I believe that could go in, that money will go into tree programs to preserve and plant, I would say preserve trees in the city. And then there's also a replanting option. So kind of what John was saying earlier, I saw a comment where John said, allow me to remove some special tree and replant where it makes sense. And that's something I think that we're exploring here, that we heard a strong community desire to preserve these large trees, but we understand that there are instances where trees might have to be removed. And so, requiring mitigation when it's a healthy, mature tree over a certain size. And then the third bullet there is if it's diseased, dead, or dying, there's not going to be a mitigation requirement there, because that tree is hazardous and something that, we don't want to preserve to cause damage to infrastructure or homes. So let me hand it off to Tim. I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, can we go back one slide? And I see that, Richard had a question, but Kevin covered it. So DBH is a forestry term for just the location where you measure the diameter of a tree. It's a chest height. So 4.5 feet off the ground is where you determine the DBH of a tree. So 30 inches or greater would be the threshold to qualify as a heritage tree. And yet we certainly realize this is a very significant proposed ordinance concept. So I think, we'll talk more about specifics in a moment, but let's bounce back to that next slide.
Yeah. So I think this kind of shows a logical flow of what we were going with. From the tree canopy action plan, we really did see a lot of loss of trees in, residential areas. We saw that lined up with building permits and, small additions and even just sort of, natural tree loss that just happens as trees age. And so out of that, we developed that policy, which you see there. And so really trying to show the tie here that, we're going forward with this out of TCAP and lots of discussion and lots of community feedback on it. But allowing those sort of options for mitigation, just getting something to preserve trees for future generations. So, there was a question about this that I was putting off.
Andrew, there was a question about access to the analysis to kind of see where there's canopy loss in neighborhoods. And so we have a very lengthy detailed analysis report that our consultants completed, the TCAP consultants that, we can make that available to everyone. And there's also, Trees Charlotte's citywide canopy analysis was a really big component that helped us really dig in to figure out what type of decline was happening. That's available on treescharlotte.org, I believe is their website. We can post a link to that in the chat. I saw that Jane was on the call here today. So that's available on their website. That's the high level view. It does get down in some detail, but we have a little bit more specific scale-based analysis in the city's TCAP analysis report that we could provide.
Yeah, and I'll also add, we actually did make the data available to the public through the Tree Canopy Action Plan, and I'm going to post a link in the chat here that has, you can actually go into a GIS map and zoom in and see tree loss or tree gains on a map. And so I think it was
on a parcel level.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it down to a patch basis. It can run it's an interesting map, but there's a little key down below. It should help you understand some of, kind of what the different, how to use the map. So hopefully that's helpful if you want to explore that. But there was also a question from Richard Winters that about removal of a mature healthy tree, and I think it might be good to take that on now. So the question was, who, if anyone, would have been asked to approve the removal of at least 2 large mature healthy trees for a small residential project where Carmel Road tees into Fairview Road? Will the proposed changes help mitigate future instances like this? What do you think?
I hate to answer questions with it depends to start off with, but I think there's some scenarios there that would make it dependent. So if the trees are in the public road right away, then they're just universally protected at all times. They're city trees. There's not a process right now that affords that type of review, permit, inspection. There's no large scale kind of permitting process, I should say, that forwards that to the city's development center staff or the city arborist group for review. If they're private property trees outside of a historic district and it's kind of an infill individual lot that's not subject to subdivision permitting, then there's likely there was no oversight or review or ordinance protection in place. That's the best I could say right now without having more specific details.
I see a question from Matt. Was any consideration given in the canopy change analysis for when development was actually created? For example, we're losing many trees in my neighborhood, but that's because they're old silver maples and they're in decline anyway. So from TCAP's perspective that's the first question. So
trying to make sure I understand. I'm reading it on my screen here. So in general, the analysis did not get into species or kind of health or risk rating. It's understood to a large degree that this is very general, right? Tree canopy is not equal. There's certainly higher quality canopy. Again, I'll use the example, if you have an acre of tree canopy that's bred for pears or some invasive species, that's certainly going to be less valuable in many ways compared to an acre of native forest or willow oaks or something like that. So the answer is no, Matt. Did not get into specifics about the species. It did look at when development occurred, that the window of time was 2012 to 2018, and that was really based on available data sets. It's difficult for tree canopy analysis. Unlike most other disciplines, we want leaf on data, right? And most other interests and disciplines want leaf off, so you can get really good topography and impervious and other types of land cover assessments. And leaf on, when trees are leafed out and there's canopy coverage, it's really hard to come by, and it's quite expensive to pay for it. So some of that change analysis window was driven by available data sets.
Right. Okay. I was just, as you look at the map and you look at the brown spots, you're like, what's going on over there? And it looks like the one down in the south is the Waverly area. And it just made me think a little bit about what's happening in those areas generally that you're looking at where the color has changed, and one assumed conclusion is it's all driven by bulldozers, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. But I think your explanation about it being driven by the data available, I think helps me better understand what we're looking at. So thank you.
Sure. I think we can get there soon. Technology-wise, we're close to being able to have species level identification. So I think in a couple of years, there will be kind of broad scale analysis tools available that we could zoom into South Charlotte. Say we did another analysis in 5 years. It's potentially feasible that we could zoom in and see, like, okay, how much of this canopy loss is just Bradford pears breaking apart during storms or just naturally aging out, and like storm damage, natural aging canopy related things. We don't have that ability right now. We do understand in residential areas that are not subdivision development, you can get that South Charlotte area is a good example. There's a lot of, somebody's unmuted there. There is a lot of canopy decline in those areas, and we understand it. Those are also areas with high patches of aging canopy, and it's places we don't regulate infill development. There's storm damage and higher volumes of city tree maintenance work orders, things like that. So there is additional analysis and kind of research that is needed to better understand what's going on in those areas. There's also been a lot of trees planted by developers, by the city, by property owners that are being picked up right now, but it'll be very interesting to see down the road what the canopy cover in those kind of recent development areas will be as they mature.
Right. Yeah, I think that'd be a very interesting study. I mean, because when everybody thinks Charlotte tree canopy, I would imagine their mind immediately goes to like Myers Park and Dilworth and the older neighborhoods that have the huge, beautiful trees. And I worry about how those guys are going to be in 30 years, because many of them are hollow and what you see on the outside is not necessarily what's going on the inside. And so to ensure that we're focusing on planning for the future, I think is really important.
I agree, and that reminds me of, of course, we don't focus on this with this group and this presentation, but the other big kind of policy areas for tree canopy policy is kind of non-regulatory strategic programs and kind of support for tree canopy maintenance. And I would say that that's really important to be private property focus, of course, city tree focus as well. But the comprehensive plan's proposing a lot of policy that essentially says the city and our partners, we need to work together to step up in those areas. And the regulatory world, the proposed mitigation payment option associated with heritage trees here and many other areas of what will be the tree article will feed into some of that kind of non-regulatory work to kind of help the comprehensive long-term planning for tree canopy. So was there another question, Andrew? I don't know. Sorry.
No, this is, no, I think, well, I don't know if you guys got to Matt's question. The 40-inch oak, is a 40-inch oak better than 4 10-inch oaks from
I think we sort of covered that in the discussion, just to focus on the future in addition to enjoying the great big beautiful ones right now.
Yeah.
Well, that's part of the challenge. I think it's a good segue into this slide. Let me speak for a moment, Andrew, then I'll give it back to you to kind of introduce this. The heritage tree reality, the biggest priority within TCAP, and I'll say all of the most recent tree canopy policy engagement efforts. over the last few years, the biggest priority among tree priorities is preservation of trees. That's both those individual, heritage type trees, specimen trees, just the big, stately trees, and also, forested areas. But we're talking about a specific tree, heritage trees right now. And it's challenging. It's challenging in the best case scenarios because they need space above and below ground. And as Andrew talks through this next slide, what will be part of the heritage tree regulations, if they move forward, is thresholds for disturbance. We understand that preserving trees is very important, large heritage trees, but there has to be a balanced approach where some level of disturbance to allow for development occurs. So, many cities have criteria that says, 20% of the critical root zone or something like that can be disturbed. So there'll be criteria that defines how much disturbance can occur. And if the site constraints exceed what really is, from a technical arborist perspective, allowed to preserve a tree reasonably with a acceptable level of risk, well then, mitigation would certainly be available to customers. And of course, if a tree is significantly unhealthy or structurally unsound, high risk, dead, there may, and of course, if it falls out of the size class or the native tree species to North Carolina, I would also emphasize, if it falls out of that class, then, it would not be protected. But if it was dead or diseased, there would not be any mitigation required. And so here's a good example here on this slide, and I'll pass it back to you, Andrew.
No, that was good. It's a good example because it's just you can kind of see from the aerial that it's a big site that doesn't have buildings on the footprint. And I know these types of places might be increasingly hard to find in Charlotte, but it's a good example of a tree that was kind of out of that building footprint area, really zooming in that tree that's kind of right along the street, that could have been preserved or could have been mitigated for. And we don't, I guess the one thing that we're missing here is we don't know what the ultimate project will look like, how many trees will be replanted, all that stuff. But from what from what we're proposing, this tree, assume it was a certain diameter. So assume it was 35 inches. There would be, you could either pay to remove that tree or remove and replant a certain level. So if it's 35 dBH, I think we're talking about half of that dBH being replanted. And we're thinking through that. And so we might ask some questions in the post OAC follow-up in terms of like, what do you think is appropriate? What's the number? But for the purpose of this discussion, it's just kind of show this could be a tree that would be preserved, hopefully by, the standards that we proposed, but open to comment and feedback on that.
And this is in the Villa Heights area, just for some kind of locational context. That's near the Plaza, Parkwood Avenue location.
Yeah. So the last theme, as we're getting close to 1:30, we'll kind of wrap up here.
Can we go back real quick?
Oh yeah.
Sorry, real quick. Just want to make sure that we touch on some other things like heritage trees. That tree on the top right there might actually be in the public right of way, so it might be a city tree. But the concept for heritage trees would apply to trees on private property.
Yeah, it's a good point.
It would not apply to a city street tree or any tree in public right of way. But just want to clarify that.
All right, next slide. The fifth theme, and this is following up on a TCAP policy of slowing canopy loss on residential property. The tree ordinance today does not require tree save. I think it expressly exempts single family lots not subject to the subdivision ordinance. So we're really looking to explore how we can update that to say, we would still exempt single family infill lots from a lot of the tree save requirements. However, where there is a development that's not subject to the subdivision ordinance, there would be a requirement to plant one tree in the front yard for every 40 feet of lot width in infill development situations. And street trees could count towards this. Tim, I don't know if you want to jump in or if you want to go to the example site. It's up to you.
Sure. I'll just provide a little more context. So essentially, this is a perimeter tree planting requirement for residential infill. I'll start with that last bullet. Street trees can count towards this requirement. The proposed concept would allow trees on the private property within a certain distance of the right-of-way, or trees in the public right-of-way, city trees, to count towards this requirement. And there'd be some criteria, with size and species, if there was some highly invasive tree species, or if it's a dead tree, or if it's a bush, that's likely not going to count, but there'd be specific guidance and criteria on that. And the planting requirement would be very similar to the current perimeter planting requirements. It's a new requirement. This type of development would not trigger new tree save regulations. Again, as I said earlier, if there was an existing tree save area that applied to the property, let's say in the backyard somewhere when the subdivision was built, if the house was in a subdivision at some time, if there was a previous tree save applied to the backyard, that would still be in place. Staff would not require any additional tree save requirements. They may look to see if the needed trees that were supposed to be there are still there. But yeah, let's move on to the next slide.
Yeah, and I see Walter's hands up, but before we get to that, we just kind of want to highlight an example site. And this is a site that's, I believe, in 3rd Ward, closer to Uptown. And, you see in 2012, single family home, big tree in the front yard, may be in that public right away. I don't think it is, actually. It's behind the sidewalk. Anyway, big tree. And it was redeveloped, and you can see the sort of existing tree canopy is gone for the most part on that site. And there really aren't even any street trees here. And, I think this was in our mind's eye as we approached this issue to say we had to do something to get some trees in the front yard. And I think we were inspired. If you just go around the corner here, if you just go down, I don't know what street that is, but go down to the end of the street and turn left. You can actually go to the next slide, Alan. You'll see this development. So this was actually probably a pretty good example. And I don't know if these are street trees or not, but essentially trees in the front yard, little area there to plant the tree. It's a similar building form, density for sure, but and a small site, but just having that tree on the public walkway is really important, not only for walkability, but for mitigating air quality in some of these areas where, there are trees today, but if development regulations don't require them, we don't know necessarily what will come. So the idea here is to require a planting of a tree for every 40 feet of lot frontage. And street trees could obviously count toward that. So I'll pause and let Tim jump in.
Yeah, it was great, Andrew. Again, I would add there will be some kind of additional criteria associated with the planting requirement. Minimum cubic feet of root, soil space for roots to grow. A minimum probably surface area width, similar to minimum standard planting strip width. There'll be things like that in play here, and it may again there may be approach based on the density. Certainly this is a very urban type of infill development scenario, and the more, I should say, less dense. Again, I'm staying on my lane here. I don't have the right planner speak, but a less dense single family area. There may be differing kind of dimensional requirements compared to the urban sites. A balanced approach.
So that's the concept. We'll pause. I haven't seen any questions other than Walter's hand, so I'll let Walter feel free to jump in if you have a question.
Thanks, Andrew. This may seem like a funny point in the conversation for this question, but when I was listening to y'all sort of roll through the numbers, paying into a fund with the fees in lieu based on size of trees and acreage and all those kind of calculations. I guess the thing that came to my mind at that point and has now gotten me back on the call is, help me understand the legal principle that gives the city the ability to charge a property owner for the removal of a tree on their own personal property. I'm just sort of curious about, suppose the city said, gee, we really like every yard to have, 14 rose bushes. And so we're going to require that you spend money and put 14 rose bushes. Where does the legal principle come from, Tim or Andrew, that says that because I own a piece of property with a tree on it, at what point does the city start to possess or take some limited ownership in that tree and determine a value for it if for my own personal use, I want to remove the tree?
So Walter, that's a great question, and we certainly could get an answer back to you. I don't feel qualified really to answer that, and we could check with our legal representation to really get a better, more informed answer for that, and we could provide that to everyone on the call at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as if it's the end of the world, and I know we've had
Sure.
some sort of this offset in the ordinance for years and years, but I always understood that to be an offset for a cost that a developer would have to spend to meet the requirements on his site. He essentially paid for the ability to meet the requirement somewhere else or through some other means. And I could understand that. I'm just talking about an individual property owner like you or me, and there's a tree that maybe we're tired of the pine sap, we don't like the pollen, for any number of reasons, an individual would make a choice. Are there components of this tree ordinance that's being discussed that would actually require that individual property owner to pay for removing a tree off of his own property at his sole discretion?
Mhm.
That's kind of that's sort of where I'm coming from.
And I'll just add, and Tim, you can jump in. I'll just add that I think that's something that we're obviously exploring. This is a new concept. This is something that we've heard a lot from the community, and TCAP was a predominant theme to protect these types of trees. But the legal implications of that obviously are something that we have to consider. And we have talked about it a little bit. I don't know where we'll ultimately land, but I'd just say it's new, and it's certainly an expressed community desire. But we're trying to figure out what we can and can't do in the process. But Tim, feel free to add to that.
No, I think it's well put. We are considering that and clarifying, again, and I can't speak for the attorney's office, but just clarifying the protection level of city trees and other trees that are regulated by what will be the tree article, and having a reasonable approach for any required mitigation, whether that's a city tree, a tree in a tree save area, or the heritage tree regulation, which there is a version of a heritage tree regulation already in the tree ordinance, but this is very different. And this is a significant step in a direction that we currently don't regulate. And, want to be clear with everyone that this heritage tree regulation would apply across the city. It's not just a development trigger scenario. It would be applicable to trees that are that size on properties, regardless of the scenario. So it's something we're absolutely exploring for a number of reasons, Walter. So appreciate that question.
No, I appreciate that, and to both of you's credit, you do a lot of quoting of the TCAP, and I'm guessing that pretty much every idea in Charlotte that was put to individuals about to preserve or protect, plant more trees, save more trees. I'm thinking that there's a high probability that everybody thought all those ideas were good ideas. I don't think you had a bunch of people in the committee that stormed in there and said the sooner we cut all these weeds down, the better. I'm just trying to think of the application of it as we go forward. And the language that's been taken out of the TCAP and put into the UDO, which then becomes the justification to put it back in, into the comp plan, which then becomes a justification to put it back in the UDO in some fashion. So I understand that everybody wants to do, the best they can. I'm just trying to think of, if I'm that property owner, it to me, it sounds like it gets right up to a line that if the city says, well, you have to pay us X $1,000 or tens of thousands of dollars to remove that tree, they've effectively taken a portion of the ownership of that real estate, which includes the tree. That was the purpose of the question. It was just to try to, what thought process had gone into that, and what was clearly, in our special act that gives us the authority for the tree ordinance. Is there something in there, for example, that might clarify that?
Yeah, and I'll push back on this. Yeah, I think I would push back on this. I think we did have a pretty good stakeholder group that had a balance of interest, and that's probably where we got the most of back and forth. I would agree with you that, the survey results, they may have skewed, more preservationist heavy. The people that responded to those may have more of a, desire to preserve trees, and we're aware of that limitation, I think, in a lot of the analysis that we did. But the stakeholder group, and many of them are on this call today, so I just want to thank them for being a part of that. Gave us that sort of back and forth to say, hey, that trees aren't the only thing that we're considering. We need to have trees for sure, but how do we do that in a development context was a special, or a careful balance that I think a lot of our stakeholders brought to that process. So, I think the TCAP policies we came up with, tried to consider that as best they could, and certainly we'll take that comment into consideration and really dig into the legal foundation as we move forward with this.
This is Alan. I think we are at the end of our allotted time, and Allison, did you want to give some closing remarks if you're there?
Actually, we were going to see if Tony's still on, if he could wrap us up.
Thank you.
I am. A very robust discussion, and the chat was very, very active today. And I just want to compliment everybody on their level of engagement, and again reiterate that it's how we come to a good result. There's lots of back and forth, and we just have to work through that. But I just want to compliment everybody today, and compliment the staff and the team on the level of detail, and just thank everybody.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, guys.
Our next meeting is tentatively scheduled for Thursday, June 10th, where hopefully we will start to talk about subdivision, streets, and infrastructure.